It started with laughter. Not the polite kind, the kind that's sharp enough to let you know exactly where you stand. She was standing near the center of the room when it happened, under crystal chandeliers, surrounded by tuxedos, champagne flutes, and people who had never once been told no. Someone pointed at her. Someone else laughed. And then the words came. The room didn't stop. The music kept playing. The smiles stayed frozen. Because moments like this are easy to ignore, when you think the woman being humiliated has no power to respond. But what the room didn't know, what the billionaire family didn't know, was that the woman they were mocking wasn't there to serve drinks. She was there to decide who walked out richer and who didn't. And with one phone call, everything changed. Before we go any further, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments. Are you watching from your couch in Atlanta? A hotel room in New York? A break room in Chicago? Let me know, because this story isn't just about one gala or one deal. It's about respect, power, and what happens when people assume the wrong thing about the wrong person. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stories like this only matter if they're heard. All right, let's go back to where it all started. The invitation said black tie, gold lettering, thick cardstock. A venue so exclusive its name alone filtered out anyone who didn't belong. Danielle Brooks arrived exactly on time. Not early, not late. On time was intentional. She stepped out of the car beneath a wash of warm light spilling from the grand ballroom windows. Crystal chandeliers glittered above marble steps. Valets moved with quiet precision. Guests floated in and out dressed in wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Danielle paused for half a second, not to admire the place, but to steady herself. She had walked into rooms like this before. Boardrooms, investor summits, government receptions. Still, she knew the truth no one ever said out loud. Rooms like this always watched her harder. Her dress was deep red, tailored perfectly, elegant without begging for approval. Her hair was styled simply. No diamonds, no excess. Power didn't need decoration. As she entered the ballroom, the sound hit first. Laughter, music, confidence. Clusters of men in tuxedos leaned in close, speaking in numbers that casually stretched into the hundreds of millions. Women in designer gowns smiled politely, already knowing who mattered and who didn't. Danielle scanned the room once. She recognized faces from financial magazines, a senator, 2 hedge fund managers, and near the center, exactly where she expected them to be, the Whitmore family. Old money, billionaires, legacy investors. Tonight was supposed to be about finalizing the deal. $700 million, clean energy, infrastructure, global expansion. Danielle's company had done what theirs couldn't. Innovated. She adjusted the phone in her hand, checking a message from her legal team. All set. Waiting on your signal. She exhaled. Then it happened. At first, it was subtle. A pause in a conversation nearby. A glance that lingered too long. A smile that curved not with warmth, but with curiosity sharpened into judgment. Danielle felt it before she heard it. A finger lifted. "Excuse me," a woman's voice rang out, loud enough to cut through the music. "Can you tell me where the restrooms are?" Danielle turned slowly. The woman stood a few feet away, mid-60s, wrapped in a navy blue gown that screamed pedigree. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled. Her smile was wide and dismissive. Danielle blinked once. "I'm sorry," she said calmly. The woman laughed, light and sharp. "The restrooms," she repeated, pointing. "You must know. You work here, right?" A few people nearby chuckled. Danielle felt the familiar tightening in her chest. "No," she said evenly. "I don't." The woman tilted her head, amused. "Oh, my mistake." But she didn't apologize. Instead, she turned to the group behind her, lowering her voice just enough to pretend discretion. "Honestly," she said, smiling, "they should dress staff more clearly at events like this." Laughter erupted. Not everyone, but enough. Danielle stood still. Every instinct told her to correct them immediately, to announce who she was, to end it. But she didn't. She had learned long ago that people revealed more when you let them. A man in a tuxedo leaned forward. "Is there a manager?" he asked. "She seems confused." Another laugh. Someone in the back raised a phone. Danielle's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in calculation. Security appeared quickly. 2 men, professional, neutral. "Ma'am," one of them said, eyes flicking between Danielle and the group. "Is there a problem?" The woman in blue pointed openly now. "Yes, she's causing a disruption." Danielle looked at the guard. "I'm not," she said, "but I am waiting for someone." The guard hesitated. Around them, the room leaned in. This was the moment, the one Danielle knew well, where dignity was tested, where silence was mistaken for weakness. She slowly raised her phone to her ear. "Hi," she said softly, eyes never leaving the woman who was still smiling. "Yes, it's me." A pause. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. "I need you to initiate the contingency." Another pause. "Yes," Danielle continued. "The Whitmore deal." The laughter behind her began to fade, not because they understood, but because something in her tone didn't fit the story they'd already written about her. Danielle nodded once. "Thank you," she said. "I'll handle the rest." She lowered the phone. The woman in blue scoffed. "Calling for backup now?" she said loudly. Danielle finally smiled. Not wide, not sweet, just enough. "No," she replied. "I'm canceling something." The word landed strangely in the air. Canceling. "What?" the woman asked. Danielle turned, scanning the room, not nervously but deliberately. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said calmly, her voice carrying just enough. "Enjoy the evening." She looked directly at the Whitmore family. "It'll be your last one like this." And just like that. The room that thought it knew her realized it never had. For 3 full seconds after Danielle spoke, no one laughed. That alone should have warned them. The woman in the blue gown blinked, her smile stiffening as if it had been paused mid-performance. Around her, people shifted, confused. Not because they understood what Danielle had just done, but because the script had changed and no one had the next line. "Canceling?" the woman repeated, chuckling lightly. "Oh, please." "You're being dramatic." A few nervous laughs followed. Not the confident kind from before. These were thinner, forced, looking for permission to exist. Danielle didn't respond. She didn't need to. She stepped to the side, calm and unhurried, as though the room had already moved on and she was simply waiting for it to catch up. That silence, her silence, made them uncomfortable. Because silence, when expected to beg, feels like defiance. What most people didn't understand, what the Whitmores had never bothered to ask, was that the deal had never lived in that ballroom. The ballroom was theater. The real work had already been done. While the room buzzed with whispers and nervous glances, Danielle stood quietly, letting the moment breathe. Across the marble floor, conversations fractured. People leaned toward one another, voices dropping, faces tight with calculation. The Whitmore advisor returned, this time without a smile. "Ms. Brooks," he said, lowering his voice, "there must be some mistake. Our legal team hasn't received." Danielle raised one finger. Not rude, not dramatic, just enough to stop him. "They will," she said, "if they haven't already." She turned slightly, giving him a clear view of her phone screen. Dark now, inactive. The call had already ended. That was the part no one ever noticed. Deals didn't fall apart when you yelled. They collapsed when clauses activated. Weeks earlier, Danielle had insisted on a contingency structure so specific it had made the Whitmores laugh. Redundant approvals, ethics triggers, reputational safeguards. They'd waved it off as corporate paranoia. Standard language, they'd said. Just sign it, they'd said. They never imagined those safeguards would be for them. Now, across the city and across the globe, emails were landing. Access was freezing. Funds were being flagged. Partners were receiving quiet notifications that something fundamental had shifted. The Whitmore son checked his phone again. His hand trembled. "Mother," he whispered. "We've been suspended." She turned sharply. "Suspended from what?" "Everything," he said. Her mouth opened, closed. She looked around the room as if someone else might explain it away. Danielle watched, expression composed. She didn't feel joy. She felt clarity. A man from one of the banks Danielle recognized, someone who had ignored her emails for months, approached now, his tone respectful in a way it hadn't been before. "Danielle," he said, using her first name carefully. "Perhaps we should step aside and discuss options." Danielle tilted her head. "Options for whom?" He hesitated. "That depends," he said slowly. She smiled, just a little. "That's what I thought." Behind them, the woman in blue had stopped laughing entirely. Her face had hardened into something brittle. "This is absurd," she snapped. "You think because you've stirred up some confusion, you can threaten us?" Danielle turned to her. "I didn't threaten anyone," she said. "I removed myself." The woman scoffed. "From what? You weren't even invited." The words landed loud enough for others to hear. The insult was meant to reclaim ground. It failed. Danielle reached into her clutch and withdrew the invitation. Folded once, creased from having been checked earlier. She handed it to the nearest guard. He read it, then read it again. Then looked up at Danielle. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly. "My apologies." The woman in blue stiffened. Danielle didn't look at her. She addressed the room. "I didn't come here to prove anything," she said, voice calm but clear. "I came because I was asked to." She paused. "And because I agreed." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some people nodded slowly now, understanding dawning. Others looked embarrassed, already rewriting their memory of the evening to soften their own involvement. Across the room, one of the Whitmore patriarchs, silent until now, stepped forward. He was older, quieter, sharper. "Ms. Brooks," he said, studying her closely. "Let's not do this here." Danielle met his gaze. "Then you shouldn't have started it here." The words weren't angry. They were final. He sighed. "You're making a mistake." Danielle shook her head. "I'm correcting one." She turned slightly, signaling the end of the conversation. Around them, phones continued to buzz, advisors whispered. A reporter near the back lifted a camera, sensing something they didn't yet understand but knew mattered. The Whitmores were losing control of the room. Worse, they were losing control of the narrative. Danielle felt it shift. The way people now stepped out of her path. The way voices lowered when she passed. The way no one laughed anymore. The woman in blue stood frozen, realization finally settling in. "You planned this," she said quietly. Danielle stopped. For the first time that night, she turned fully to face her. "I planned to protect myself," Danielle replied. "What you chose to do with that opportunity was up to you." The woman swallowed. Danielle didn't wait for a response. She walked past her, heels steady against marble, moving through a crowd that now parted instinctively. No applause, no confrontation, just space. At the entrance, Danielle paused long enough to send one final message. Proceed. Outside, the night air felt cooler, quieter, honest. Behind her, the ballroom buzzed, not with laughter now, but with damage control. Inside, the Whitmore empire was scrambling. And Danielle Brooks? She was already gone. A man from the Whitmore circle leaned toward her, lowering his voice in what he clearly believed was authority. Listen, he said, smiling thinly. If there's been a misunderstanding, we can clear it up quietly. No need to embarrass yourself. Embarrass yourself. Danielle met his eyes. I'm not embarrassed, she said. That landed harder than shouting ever could. The man frowned. You should be careful, he added. This isn't a room you want to play games in. Around them, whispers began to spread. Who does she think she is? Is she someone's plus one? Why is she still standing there? Security hovered closer now, not aggressively, but with intention. The woman in blue straightened her posture, reclaiming what she thought was control. Enough of this, she said. Escort her out. We have serious people waiting. Danielle turned to the guards. I'll leave, she said calmly, when I'm finished. The guard hesitated again. That hesitation was new. Danielle saw it, the flicker of doubt. Because staff didn't speak like that. Staff didn't hold eye contact. Staff didn't look prepared. The guard opened his mouth to speak when phones began to vibrate. At first it was subtle. A buzz here, a screen lighting up there. Then more. Across the room, a man near the bar frowned at his phone. Another stepped aside to answer a call, his face tightening as he listened. Danielle didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her phone resting at her side now, her posture relaxed, as though she were waiting for something inevitable to arrive. The woman in blue noticed the shift too. She glanced around, irritation creeping into her expression. What is going on? No one answered her. One of the Whitmore sons, mid-30s, polished, confident, looked down at his phone again. His face drained slightly of color. Mother, he said quietly, we might need a minute. She waved him off. Now is not the time. He swallowed. I think it is. Danielle watched them closely. This was the moment people like her were rarely allowed to witness. The moment power recalibrated itself in real time. The music continued to play, but it felt distant now, like background noise to something unraveling underneath. A man in a gray suit hurried across the floor, his smile gone completely. He stopped in front of the Whitmores, speaking urgently, too fast, too low. Danielle couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. The woman in blue stiffened. What do you mean, paused? She snapped. More phones buzzed. Across the ballroom, a hedge fund manager laughed once, short, incredulous, then stopped. He looked up, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Danielle, and stayed there. The realization didn't hit everyone at once. It never does. It moves like a wave. Quiet at first, then unmistakable. People began to look at Danielle differently now. Not up, not down, sideways, reevaluating. The security guard nearest her cleared his throat. Ma'am, he said carefully, may I have your name? Danielle turned to him fully for the first time. Danielle Brooks, she said. CEO, Brooks Global Infrastructure. The guard's eyes widened, not dramatically, just enough. He stepped back half a pace. The woman in blue laughed sharply. That's ridiculous! But her voice cracked. One of the Whitmore advisors approached Danielle, his tone suddenly deferential. Ms. Brooks, he said, forcing a smile. Perhaps we should talk privately. Danielle shook her head. No, she replied. Public is fine. The advisor glanced nervously at the Whitmores. Ms. Brooks, he tried again. This deal is complicated. Danielle nodded. It was. She paused, just long enough for the weight of the word to settle. Now it's canceled. The word echoed differently this time. Not as a threat, as a fact. A hush fell over the immediate area. Conversations nearby died mid-sentence. People leaned in without meaning to. The Whitmore matriarch stared at Danielle, disbelief hardening into anger. You can't just walk in here and destroy $700 million, she said. Do you have any idea who we are? Danielle stepped closer. Not aggressively, not triumphantly. Just close enough. Yes, she said softly. That's why I built a deal you couldn't survive without me. For the first time all evening, the room understood. And it terrified them. Because the woman they had laughed at had never been asking for permission. She had been waiting. By the time Danielle reached her car, the Whitmores were already in damage control mode. Inside the ballroom, voices overlapped. Advisors whispered urgently. Phones were pressed to ears with the kind of intensity that came only when money, not pride, was at risk. But the problem wasn't the canceled deal. It was that the Whitmores didn't understand how it had happened. They had always believed power announced itself. Danielle had never needed to. Weeks earlier, during the first negotiation call, the Whitmores had barely looked at her. Their cameras were angled poorly. Their attention wandered. One of them had muted his mic and spoken freely, assuming she couldn't hear. Who's the diversity hire? Someone had asked. They'd laughed then. Danielle hadn't corrected them. She'd taken notes. The Whitmores had inherited their empire the way people inherit language, without effort, without examination. They'd grown up in rooms where doors opened automatically, where respect arrived before proof was ever demanded. That was why they'd never asked Danielle's name twice, why they'd never Googled her beyond a surface glance, why they'd assumed she was lucky to be in the conversation at all. Back at the gala, the matriarch finally snapped. Get legal on the line, she barked. Now! They're already on, an advisor replied, pale. So are the banks. What about our partners? She demanded. The advisor swallowed. Some are reconsidering. Reconsidering. A word the Whitmores weren't used to hearing. Meanwhile, across town, Danielle sat in the back seat of her car, city lights sliding past the window. She loosened her shoulders slightly, not from relief, but from release. She replayed the evening once, not the laughter, the silence afterward. That was the moment she remembered. Her phone buzzed. A message from her COO. They're unraveling faster than expected. Danielle exhaled slowly. Good, she typed back. That means they didn't prepare. At Whitmore headquarters, conference rooms filled. Screens lit up. Lawyers spoke in clipped, cautious language. This clause, one attorney said, tapping the document, wasn't symbolic. Why was it even there? The matriarch snapped. Because you signed it, he replied evenly. Silence fell. The truth was uncomfortable. They had underestimated her at every turn. They'd skimmed the contract, delegated the review, dismissed the warnings. They'd assumed leverage was permanent. Danielle had known better. That was the real cost of arrogance. Not humiliation, but exposure. Back in the ballroom, guests were leaving early now, murmuring excuses. No one wanted to be too close to whatever this was becoming. A few approached the Whitmores offering sympathy. Most didn't. People were already adjusting. That's how power behaved when it sensed instability. It shifted allegiance without apology. Danielle arrived home quietly. No champagne, no celebration. She slipped off her heels and stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, staring out at the city she'd built her career in. She thought of the first boardroom she'd ever entered, the one where a man had asked her to take notes before she'd even sat down. She thought of the times she'd been told she was too composed, too sharp, too intimidating. She smiled faintly. Those traits had just cost someone else $700 million. Her phone rang. This time it was an unfamiliar number. Danielle considered letting it go to voicemail, then answered. "Ms. Brooks," a male voice said carefully. "This is Thomas Whitmore." She listened. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he continued. "Perhaps we can discuss restoring the deal under revised terms." Danielle leaned against the counter. "No," she said calmly. A pause. "We're willing to offer concessions," he added quickly. "Equity. Control." Danielle closed her eyes briefly. "You still don't understand," she said. "This was never about terms." Silence. Then quieter. "Then what was it about?" Danielle chose her words carefully. "Respect," she said. "And you decided how much that was worth." She ended the call. Across the city, the Whitmore family sat with something unfamiliar. Consequences that couldn't be negotiated. The press would follow. The investors would ask questions. The story would spread. Not as gossip, as a lesson. And Danielle Brooks? She poured herself a glass of water, checked tomorrow's calendar, and moved on. Because she hadn't destroyed anything. She had simply stopped pretending. And the family that never asked her name? They would never forget it now. By morning, the headlines had found their angle. They always did. Billion-dollar gala ends in chaos. Power shift rocks investment world. Whitmore deal collapses overnight. But none of them got the most important part right. The deal hadn't collapsed overnight. It had been unstable from the beginning. Danielle sat at the long conference table in Brooks Global's headquarters, sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows. Around her, her leadership team waited, calm, prepared, unhurried. They'd rehearsed this moment, not the humiliation, the response. Rebecca, her chief legal officer, tapped a tablet and projected the contract onto the wall. "Section 14.3, she said. Reputational harm clause. A paragraph lit up. If any party engages in public conduct that materially undermines the integrity, dignity, or ethical standing of the partnership, the counterparty may terminate without penalty. One of the executives nodded. They laughed when we insisted on that. Danielle remembered. They'd called it overcautious, political, unnecessary. She'd let them think that. What about the capital reroute? Asked the CFO. Rebecca swiped again. Already executed. Funds transferred to the Harlow Consortium at 9:42 p.m. A murmur of approval moved around the table. The Whitmores had assumed money was loyal. Danielle knew it was efficient. Across town, the Whitmore boardroom was anything but calm. Thomas Whitmore slammed his hand onto the table. Who authorized this structure? No one answered. Because they all had. Or worse, they hadn't checked. Their legal counsel spoke carefully. The clause was standard once agreed upon. Enforcement is airtight. Airtight? The matriarch snapped. We're being bled in public. Public conduct triggered public consequences, the attorney replied. That sentence landed like a verdict. Back at Brooks Global, Danielle listened as her team reviewed fallout projections. Short-term backlash from Whitmore-aligned outlets, Rebecca said, but long-term sentiment favors us, strongly. Investor confidence? Danielle asked. Up, the CFO replied, quietly but decisively. Danielle nodded. That was the difference between noise and reality. She stood and walked toward the window, looking down at the city below. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about boundaries. She'd learned early in her career that deals built on disrespect were never safe, no matter how profitable they looked on paper. They always came due. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number, She ignored it. Let them sit in the silence for a while. In the Whitmore offices, silence was doing damage. Phones rang unanswered. Emails stacked up. Advisors began suggesting exits instead of strategies. One junior analyst finally asked the question no one wanted to voice. Why didn't we know who she was? No one responded. Because the answer was obvious and ugly. They hadn't thought it mattered. Danielle returned to the table. Prepare the statement, she said. No gloating, no defensiveness. Rebecca nodded. Values-driven. Professional. And forward-looking, Danielle added. We're not looking back. Across the room, a screen lit up with breaking news. Harlow Consortium confirms acquisition previously linked to Whitmore Group. Danielle allowed herself a small breath. The future had already moved on. At the Whitmore estate, Thomas Whitmore stared at the same headline. This is a mistake, he muttered. She'll come back to the table. The matriarch didn't respond. She was finally realizing something that frightened her more than loss. Danielle Brooks didn't need them, and never had. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Danielle closed her laptop and gathered her things. She wasn't staying late. There was no emergency anymore. As she walked out, Rebecca fell into step beside her. They underestimated you, Rebecca said quietly. Danielle shook her head. They underestimated themselves. Rebecca smiled. Outside, cameras waited, but Danielle passed them without stopping. Statements were for people trying to explain. She didn't owe anyone that. The deal had never been safe. Not because of money, not because of risk, but because respect had never been mutual. And now, everyone could see what that cost. The story broke before the markets even opened. By 6:30 a.m., Danielle's name was trending, not because she'd said anything, but because the silence around her had become impossible to ignore. Who is Danielle Brooks? How did a $700 million deal vanish in one night? What really happened at the gala? Clips from the ballroom began circulating online. Short, shaky videos, half-heard laughter, a finger pointing, Danielle standing still while voices rose around her. The internet did what it always did. It filled in the gaps. But this time, the gaps pointed in the same direction. By mid-morning, financial networks picked up the story. Analysts stopped speculating and started confirming. This wasn't an emotional decision, one commentator said on air. This was contractual, clean, strategic. Another added, the Whitmore Group didn't lose a deal. They triggered a clause. The words triggered a clause echoed everywhere. At Whitmore headquarters, the phones never stopped ringing. Board members demanded explanations. Junior partners asked for reassurances no one could give. One major institutional investor quietly pulled out, no announcement, no press release, just a withdrawal. That kind hurt the most. Thomas Whitmore stared at the numbers scrolling across the screen. Down 12%, then 14%. His assistant hesitated at the door. Sir, the press is asking for a statement. He rubbed his temples. We'll release something soon. But soon never came. Every draft sounded wrong, too defensive, too vague, too late. Meanwhile, at Brooks Global, Danielle's team moved with precision. They didn't celebrate. They didn't posture. They verified. Rebecca stood at the head of the communications meeting. Our message is simple. We value professionalism, dignity, and ethical partnership. That's it. No names? Someone asked. No, Danielle said. The facts are enough. Across the city, the Whitmore matriarch watched a news segment replay the gala footage. There she was, laughing, pointing, calling security. The frame froze on her expression. Her hand tightened around the remote. Turn it off, she snapped. But the damage was already done. Because humiliation, once recorded, doesn't fade. It multiplies. By afternoon, former Whitmore partners began issuing careful statements. We were not present. We do not condone the behavior. We are reviewing our associations. Those words were surgical. They weren't angry. They were distancing. At 3:12 p.m., the Whitmore family's largest international partner suspended negotiations. No explanation given. Just a pause. Danielle watched the update from her office, unreadable. Rebecca leaned in. "They're asking if you'll do an interview." Danielle shook her head. "Let them talk," she said. "I'm working." Outside, the narrative continued without her. A business magazine released a profile, the CEO who didn't raise her voice. Another headline followed, "Power doesn't announce itself anymore." The Whitmore sons tried to respond online. It backfired. Screenshots resurfaced, old comments, patterns. The internet connected dots the family had never bothered to hide. By evening, Thomas Whitmore finally spoke publicly. "We regret any misunderstanding," he said stiffly. "This situation was blown out of proportion." The response was immediate and brutal, because by then, the proportion was clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was exposure. Danielle's phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. "A lot of people owe you an apology." She didn't reply. Apologies didn't rebuild trust. Systems did. As night fell, protesters gathered outside Whitmore offices, not many but visible, signs held high, cameras rolling. It wasn't about Danielle anymore. It was about accountability. Inside their penthouse, the matriarch stood at the window, city lights reflecting in the glass. "They're turning on us," she said quietly. Thomas didn't answer. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. Because the collapse wasn't loud. It was procedural. Investors leaving, partners rethinking, silence replacing certainty. Danielle shut down her computer and gathered her coat. "Tomorrow," Rebecca said, "will be worse for them." Danielle nodded. "Then we'll do our job." As she stepped into the elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. Calm. Composed. Unmoved. The world outside was shifting, but she hadn't pushed it. She had simply stopped holding it up. And the family that thought power protected them? They were learning the difference between visibility and strength. Power doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It relocates. Danielle understood that better than anyone in the room. By the third day after the gala, the Whitmores were no longer the center of the conversation. That was the most telling part. In business, outrage fades quickly, but abandonment lingers. Danielle sat in a quiet corner of a private conference suite overlooking the river. No cameras, no press, just glass, light, and people who had learned to read silence the way others read contracts. Across the table sat three executives from firms that had once aligned themselves closely with the Whitmores. They weren't defensive. They weren't apologetic. They were practical. "We're reassessing our exposure," one of them said carefully. "We'd like to understand where Brooks Global is headed next." Danielle folded her hands lightly on the table. "We're continuing exactly as planned," she said, "with partners who understand alignment isn't optional." No threats, no gloating, just direction. The executives nodded. They asked questions about infrastructure timelines, regional risk, and governance. Danielle answered each one cleanly, precisely, as though the Whitmores had never existed, because in her world, they already didn't. Across town, the Whitmore offices were hollowing out. 2 senior advisors resigned by midweek. A longtime consultant quietly removed the Whitmore name from his firm's website. Meetings were postponed, then canceled. Not dramatically, administratively. The matriarch noticed it first, not in the headlines, but in the invitations that stopped arriving. A charity gala postponed due to scheduling. a foundation dinner restructured, a board retreat reconsidered. These were the soft exits, the ones no one announced. Danielle watched the shift without satisfaction. This wasn't personal. It was gravity. At Brooks Global, Rebecca briefed the leadership team. 3 new institutions want in, she said. They're offering better terms than Whitmore ever did. Danielle nodded. Vet them carefully. Already started. Outside the glass walls, the city moved on. Cranes lifted steel. Traffic flowed. The future didn't wait for anyone to catch up. That afternoon, Danielle attended a closed-door policy forum. No fanfare, no introductions beyond names and titles. This time, no one mistook her for staff. Not because she corrected anyone, but because someone else did before she had to speak. That's Danielle Brooks, a senior official murmured to a colleague. She's the reason last week's numbers shifted. The colleague nodded, impressed. Respect had arrived quietly. At Whitmore Manor, Thomas Whitmore sat alone in the study, staring at a stack of unread letters. Old friends, old partners, words carefully chosen but unmistakable. We wish you well. This is an appropriate time for reflection. Our organizations are moving in different directions. He set one letter down slowly. They're leaving, he said aloud. The matriarch didn't respond. She was watching a clip on her tablet. Danielle speaking at the forum, calm, assured, framed by neutral light. She hasn't said a word about us, the matriarch muttered. Thomas exhaled. That's the worst part. Back at Brooks Global, Danielle stood by the window again, city lights beginning to glow. Rebecca approached quietly. The Whitmores requested a meeting. Danielle didn't turn. When? As soon as possible. Danielle considered it. No, she said finally. We've already met. Rebecca smiled faintly. The truth was, nothing more needed to be said. The market had spoken. The partners had chosen. The room had rearranged itself. That evening, Danielle attended a small dinner. 8 people, none of them flashy. The kind of people who didn't need to be seen to matter. Conversation flowed easily. Projects discussed. Futures sketched. At one point, a woman across the table leaned in. You know, she said softly, I watched the footage. Danielle met her eyes. I don't envy you, the woman continued, but I respect you. Danielle nodded once. That's enough. Because respect, real respect, didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with opportunity. By the time Danielle returned home, her calendar had shifted again. New meetings, new regions, new leverage. The Whitmores were no longer a concern. They were a footnote. And as Danielle shut off the lights and prepared for the next day, one thing was clear. She hadn't taken power from anyone. She had simply stepped forward and let the world decide where power belonged now. By the following week, the story had settled into history. Not forgotten, just understood. The headlines moved on, as they always did. Another scandal, another rise, another fall. But something about this one lingered in the spaces that mattered most. Boardrooms, investor calls, private dinners where people spoke more carefully than they used to. Danielle Brooks never commented publicly. She didn't need to. Her calendar said everything. New partners replaced old ones. Projects advanced without delay. Markets adjusted, not violently, but decisively, like a body correcting its balance after a long imbalance. At Brooks Global, the atmosphere was steady, focused. The team gathered in the conference room for the first quarterly meeting since the gala. No one mentioned the Whitmores by name. They didn't have to. Rebecca clicked through slides outlining expansion timelines. Asia Pacific, East Africa, domestic infrastructure. The work continued. That was the point. When the meeting ended, a junior analyst lingered by the door. "Ms. Brooks?" he said hesitantly. Danielle looked up. "Yes?" "I just wanted to say, watching how you handled everything." He stopped, searching for the right word. It mattered. Danielle studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Remember this," she said. "Power doesn't always raise its voice, but it always keeps receipts." He smiled, understanding more than he had a week ago. That evening, Danielle attended one final event connected to the fallout. Not a gala, not a panel, but a quiet fundraiser hosted in a private home. No chandeliers, no press, just conversation. As she entered, a woman she didn't recognize approached immediately. "I'm sorry," the woman said softly. "We met once. I didn't listen." Danielle tilted her head slightly. "That happens," she replied. The woman hesitated. "I won't make that mistake again." Danielle accepted the apology, not because she needed it, but because the woman needed to give it. Across the room, someone introduced Danielle as the CEO who changed the rules. Danielle smiled politely. She hadn't changed the rules. She had enforced them. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Danielle stood by the window one last time. The city stretched out below her like a living map. She thought about the moment in the ballroom, the laughter, the finger-pointing, the assumptions layered so thick they'd felt structural. She remembered the silence afterward, the recalibration, the shift. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't explained herself. She hadn't begged for recognition. She had let the system do what it was designed to do, once it was forced to acknowledge her presence. Her phone buzzed. A single message from Rebecca. "Deal finalized. Clean close. Congratulations." Danielle typed back 2 words. "Good work." She set the phone down and poured herself a glass of water. No champagne. This wasn't a celebration. It was a conclusion. Somewhere across the city, the Whitmore offices were quieter now, smaller. Their name still carried weight, but no longer unquestioned. That was the real consequence. Not humiliation. Recalibration. Danielle turned off the lights and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring meetings, negotiations, decisions. The work continued. And that was the point the room had missed from the beginning. She never needed to prove she belonged. She had built something that required her presence. And when the room failed to recognize that, she didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply took the future with her and left.